you've been following along with us, and a lot of you have, thanks for sticking with us throughout the day. I haven't, told that many funny jokes, but I do have Easter eggs that I've been dropping for the raffle. So if you're still collecting those Easter eggs, those secret codes, so to speak, I'll drop one for you guys right now. We'll go with telehealth. So one word, you can use that to get additional entries. If you are here watching with us in the iCareAdvisors booth, make sure you check in. You could talk to the folks here on this call, who I'll introduce in just a second as well, if you've got any questions, after we hang up. But if you do have questions throughout the talk, you can punch them in here on YouTube in the chat, of course. If you are on Covalent Careers watching, you'll have to press that button to navigate to YouTube, type your questions in, but I'll keep an eye on the chat. And, I think we'll have a lot of fun. This is definitely a topic that people are really interested in, and we thought that there were no two better guys to talk about it than you. So, for those of you that don't know, Doctors Eric Bass and Bob Steinmetz, they're of iCareAdvisors, of course. They're a company that they started to help ODs really, at any stage of their career, open cold, particularly, under the stresses of different student loans, financial burdens, that kind of thing. And, you guys have really made it a mission to help, particularly young ODs overcome all of those challenges with opening cold and help people reach their full potential as private practice owners. So, thanks for joining us. We've done a lot of stuff together, obviously, and, it's always fun being with you guys and talking private practice and opening cold. So, I've got some questions for you. I know a lot of people probably have questions, but, before COVID, it was already scary enough thinking about opening cold. Now during this time with practices closing their doors and, some uncertainty around when they can start seeing patients again, there's a lot on people's minds. So let's kind of take it from the top and I guess work our way down and work through it all. But, maybe kind of what have you guys been seeing right now in terms of, cold starts or in terms of activity or interest in opening cold? I mean, and what has your advice been to those folks that have been interested and now are kind of on pause?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, we sincerely want to thank you guys for having us. You guys always put out incredible content, have an amazing platform, and this virtual career fair is certainly no exception. So Bob and I are happy to be a part of this and deliver the information certainly the best that we can and answer any questions that come up along the way. The short answer to your question is, as it relates to starting cold in the midst of COVID-19, what we're actually seeing is the presentation of perhaps one of the best opportunities ever to cold start. A lot of the economic and industry factors are starting to swing into our favor. We're seeing favorable lending, interest rates. Banks are still lending for cold start projects. The interest rates have gone down, so we have lower interest rates than we had pre-COVID. Perhaps most importantly is we've gained exponential leverage on the tenant side as far as going into a lease because the retail spaces, there's so much uncertainty. There's not many professions or many opportunities for tenants to go in with a proven platform like optometry that's been around for 150 plus years, and we know it's proven. It's not someone trying out the new cupcake shop, as I talk about all the time. It's not someone trying a new concept. It's tried and true. It's insurance driven. The demand is already there, and perhaps most importantly, what we're seeing in many states is patients have not been able to receive routine eye care for probably 3 months by the time we start to get into the clear, back resuming to routine eye care exams again. And so we have this buildup of patient demand as well. And so given that the cold start process from start to finish on average is taking, I would say, 9 months from the time that a client decides to start looking at locations to the time that they open their doors, they're going to be in position 1A with the best terms that we've ever seen and in a position to take on this increased patient demand.
Yeah, no, that's exciting stuff. I mean, because you might, the first instinct is to think, oh man, I can't open cold right now. There's practices that are closed. They're not opening their doors, but it sounds like now might be actually the perfect time based upon a lot of the things that you just said. I mean, I know there are always challenges with opening cold, and you guys have spoken about these challenges many, many times, and we've got a lot of great resources that people who are watching can also check out in your booth. But maybe some of those challenges tend to be kind of around finances or maybe other things, but have those are those challenges still the same even in the climate we're in right now? And the challenges that are typical or common, are they less so much of a challenge now than before? And maybe that goes back to the lending thing that you were talking about.
I would say on the finance side, things have remained pretty much equal. The only difference, of course, is there's a lot of individuals as associates that are either currently furloughed or laid off or in between positions. And really the key is kind of the bank stance is so long as by the time you need to actually start drawing your funds, you're in the same financial position that you needed to be before, then everything is fine. They're not lending to individuals that are currently, if you're on unemployment when you go to actually draw your funds, which typically doesn't happen until 3-4 months into your project, then there's going to be a freeze in the timeline, and you'll need to wait until you have your associating income. But you've always needed associating income to draw off these loans anyways. And so, the sort of approach has changed a little bit, but the actual dynamics of lending has not changed. It has not gotten any stricter. We're still seeing them just as willing to lend to optometry. And they're actually seeing in a lot of the dental spaces, optometry is kind of becoming, they feel that optometry is going to be returning to work quicker, if you will, than dental, and didn't take quite as hard of a hit on the front end either. So optometry, again, is positioned very well.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, and I've heard a lot in the news lately that there might be a return to care, like you said, kind of, loosening those criterion of kind of essential care, that kind of thing, as far as optometry goes, which is definitely encouraging. Um, but do you feel like with still, there's still that sort of, well, maybe we're not going to be going back to care 100%, right? Kind of slowly, increase that level of care, or just seeing patients? I mean, do you think that has shifted the timeline? And I know you had just said earlier that typically it's around 9 months for a cold start. Do you think it shifts the timeline at all in terms of how quickly you might want to get through the process? I mean, should you try to push to get through it earlier? Should you kind of delay it a little bit more? I mean, because it's hard to know when this will all be done in and of itself.
So, Antonio, I think it's a great question. When you take a look at, the environment that we're in right now, the best thing about cold starts is that they practice social distancing anyway. There are not people.
It's true, right?
There are not people lined up out the door or banging in to go see a cold start for the first time. So we have an advantage as a cold start over most of these other practices that are trying to figure out how to keep their patients 6 feet away from one another. We already are able to do that just based on the fact that they have a skeleton crew to start with by opening lean. And we have an extended timeline to be able to space these patients out over time. I'm actually at my office today. We came in to see emergency patients today, practicing CDC protocols. Already seen, 4 patients this morning with, significant injuries or ulcers. And private practice, I think, has allowed people to realize that, they have more options when they own their own place. I think this has given some time for people to reflect on, some of their corporate positions. We've gotten a lot of inquiries of people that have been sitting at home for a long period of time and haven't been able to access the patients that need their care because of corporate restrictions. We've been able to keep our practice open here, practicing that social distancing guidelines, making sure CDC guidelines are followed. But in private practice, you just have a lot more flexibility. And particularly when you're a cold start, we're going to be able to ramp up to kind of a normal trajectory here by simply following CDC guidelines anyway, because those patients are spaced out. So it's actually not going to change that much for a lot of our practices that'll be opening right after the epidemic restrictions are starting to be released.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Bob. And you know what? I'm looking here at some questions coming in, and you know, I had a couple questions for you guys around this, but someone kind of beat me to the punch here. And the question is, you know, my original question was, you know, when you think about starting cold, you obviously think about certain equipment that you might have, or you might integrate technology into your practice, that kind of thing. You know, will that look different now, or would you advise people to do differently? And the reason why I'm asking is, and it sounds like someone kind of might have been thinking the same thing, is that, you know, would you advise all cold starts provide telehealth services? And, you know, considering it might become part of the new, you know, in quotations here, new normal going forward. So, you know, any thoughts on that? Any ideas on how practices can integrate into that? Do you guys think that that will definitely become part of the cold start planning?
I certainly think so. And, you know, a lot of this is also demographic dependent. So a majority of the cold starts, they're young, they're entrepreneurial, they're very, very tech savvy, and their patients have a tendency to be within, you know, 10 years above or below, you know, their given age. So they're also tech savvy as well. And I think a lot of us have used telehealth, you know, over this epidemic and have started to realize the benefits across the country. I think not only are patients realizing the benefits, but also lawmakers. You've seen a lot of insurance companies been very quick to make adaptations to integrating telehealth within optometry, within just general physicians' practices. And I think to hit the ground running with telehealth is certainly an advantage, especially when you're talking about a younger patient base that kind of surrounds your average cold start to begin with.
Yeah, fantastic. Any other kind of things that might change as a practice starts cold? Because in a way, you know, kind of like you guys are saying, you know, the one nice thing about opening cold is that you get to start from scratch, right? So you kind of get to mold and shape your practice the way it, you know, you want it to be. But, you know, any other things that you guys can think of that might change, you know, maybe it's structural changes, you know, maybe it's the way you kind of set your practice up. What does the waiting room look like? What does the, you know, the exam lane look like? Any kind of changes there that you guys can think of as well that might become part of plans that, you know, or maybe not, you know, maybe everything pretty much stays the same.
I think, you know, from an actual spatial design perspective, I think there is definitely a renewed conversation about one-way traffic flow within an office. So, you know, kind of the concept of not having patients return to where they came from. So they progressively go through the practice. Certainly a challenge of that can just be square footage. When we think back to the old practices, you know, 20 years ago, that had these large circular designs where you kind of started in one place and got spit out into the optical in the other. You know, I think we might try to, you know, start to see a hybrid between those two. I'll let Bob talk a little bit about the exam components as it relates to that as well. But I think by and large, the most important thing by far is simply just going to be, you know, the PPE measures taken by the staff and the doctors and those individuals that are working with those patients, and how the patient is handled from the time that they come in. Certainly the vast majority of existing practices aren't going to be able to make dramatic you know, spatial changes within their space. We do have the luxury of doing that with cold starts. And so it's certainly part of the conversation and something that we'll be looking into as we move forward on future projects.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, another question popped up here. Actually, I've got two questions here. One is, you know, going back to kind of, you know, the whole spatial thing that you're just talking about, Eric, but, you know, have you guys seen any changes in the real estate market, or, you know, maybe there are changes right now in the real estate market that are starting to show up? And do you think there will be better locations maybe opening up to kind of put practices in because of this?
It's possible. You know, I've had extensive conversations with real estate brokers over the last few weeks, from Car Healthcare Realty, from Excite Realty, and you know, the consensus is maybe, but probably not something to hang your hat on as far as your plan. So, you know, if there's an individual that has had their heart set on a specific retail strip location within a city, for them to just sit back and wait and say, well, I'm sure one of those 10 businesses isn't going to be able to reopen their doors. There's so many dynamics of lease defaults and things that are taking place behind the scenes that, you know, it could be a year or two before you're in a position to actually be able to come in as the tenant. And I think in more scenarios than not, you would see people missing out on the opportunities of their timeline and what they're trying to accomplish, rather than kind of, if they're ready, diving in now. And so certainly, yes, I do think there's going to be some scenarios whereby you see a location come available that perhaps didn't. A perfect example would be someone who was already in a lease negotiation. They were at the 1 yard line. They were about to sign the lease on a vacant space. So it's not listed. It wasn't available. And suddenly they pull back. Well, now that's a new opportunity for somebody. But, you know, kind of the waiting game of, I'm sure some of these businesses aren't going to survive and I'll wait it out. I don't think that's a great strategy, because I think it will significantly set your timeline back and be very unpredictable.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, one thing that kind of popped up was, you know, and I know you guys are very much advocates of, you know, starting lean and, you know, lean starts and that kind of thing. But you had mentioned earlier about kind of favorable lending rates and loans and that kind of thing. I mean, do you think now is a good time to maybe to borrow maybe more money than you might have thought about borrowing, or maybe it's a bad idea because things might be a little bit slower out of the gate depending on how this kind of turns up? And, you know, what about adopting equipment? You know, we had spoken about the whole telehealth thing, but what about, you know, looking at this as an opportunity to bring kind of maybe that extra piece of equipment that, you know, maybe you didn't need in the beginning, but maybe now is a good time? I mean, any thoughts on that?
I'll start with the broad picture, and then Bob can speak specifically to the equipment pieces as well. But, you know, the short answer is no. You know, our pro formas are based and built upon the trajectories that we expect based on patient volume. And so in any given geography, you have a revenue per patient that we're predicting. We predict how many patients we think are going to come through the door in month 1 and month 6 and month 12 and month 18 and beyond. And, you know, spending more money on your build out, or spending more money on certain aspects of the project, or taking more square footage than you normally would, simply because the lease terms are better, you still have to pay to build that space out. So that costs additional money as well. And all you're effectively doing is raising the debt service on the practice, yet the revenues aren't going to be expected to be any different. And so I think they're putting themselves at a deficit. Our focus will remain to stay lean. You can always spend more money after the fact. It's very easy, as Bob can certainly, you know, speak to as well, add equipment and those sorts of things, you know, overnight if you want to. So I'll let him talk about that a little bit too.
Yeah, on the equipment front, I mean, I had 5 conversations yesterday with individuals that were looking to add larger pieces of diagnostic equipment, because companies out there right now are being very aggressive. They don't have a market for established practices to pick up larger pieces of diagnostic equipment, and they are targeting the cold start market. And when you take a look at the offers that are out there right now, they're doing a lot of 0% for 6 months, or even, you know, deferred payments for 6 months, 0% for 5 years. There's a variety of unique kind of financing structures out there. The problem is that really doesn't help a cold start acquire new technology, because then they're going to have a bill 7 months down the road that's larger than they're used to handling, that doesn't follow their typical pro forma. So my conversations have been with the financing companies. It's our job to negotiate kind of step rates for each of these, which have decreased and allowed us to add some newer, larger pieces of technology that are more expensive, but we still follow this stepwise trajectory. We want to have a small monthly payment for 6 months, a little bit larger for 6 months, a little bit larger 6 months after that, until year 3, when cold starts really hit their stride. That's the important piece of it. When it comes to COVID and kind of the new world we're living in now, diagnostic technology has become a little bit, you know, more important. You know, and Optos is one example. If you can minimize contact with a patient and maybe reduce some normal dilation procedures, you're minimizing contact, you're decreasing the risk of exposure. I know a lot of people have been exploring options, not only telehealth earlier. We happen to use Doxy at our practice here, which is very simple, efficient, easy to sign up for. It's doxy.me. You can actually begin some of the patient interview process in their vehicle outside, which is minimizing the contact, you know, between provider and patient. So there are some opportunities there, and I think technology does allow us to limit that. But again, the most important thing is making sure that we are following a cold start trajectory, making sure that our decisions line up with the pro forma and the mission of the practice, and not just to splurge just because they happen to have an incredible financing deal for $0 for the first 6 months.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic advice. And I know someone had popped up a question, and Eric, you had touched on this a little bit earlier. And, you know, if this person kind of joined in late in the discussion, the question was around managing and planning for cash flow. how has that kind of changed the whole cash flow model? Maybe you're when you're opening cold, you're thinking, I need a business plan, that kind of thing. If you can kind of provide some insight into that. I know you touched on it in a way already.
So when we talk about these projects typically being 100% financed, that includes working capital and starting cash upon opening. And so typically the loans are broken into three general buckets. You have your equipment and your hard costs, you have your leasehold improvements and your soft costs, and then you have your working capital as well. So ideally, we're looking for practices to have, somewhere in the $50,000 to $60,000 range in cash on hand. That's highly dependent, of course, on how much their rent amount is. Some practices start in a space and rent is only, $1,500 or $2,000 per month all in, and others in, higher demand markets or more urban communities are going to be, $6,000 a month, which is certainly a big difference and a much larger nut to crack every single month. And so it's going to be variable. That is a scenario whereby, for many of these programs for lending, the nice thing is you can borrow perhaps a bit of a buffer on the working capital side, and they allow prepayment for certain percentages of the principal. And so if you don't end up utilizing the funds, you can certainly just pay them back early and then not have to take the interest hit in turn at the end. So, again, I don't think the dynamics have changed too much from that perspective. I do want to tie off one other quick point just based on what you talked about earlier. The push for larger square footages because the lease terms may be better. Typically, just on average, again, if we just look across the board, price per square foot for build outs are going to land around $100 per square foot. So every 100 square feet additional that you take in space is theoretically going to be another $10,000 out of pocket for build out. And again, not yielding any higher patient volume than what you would have seen in the first place on 100 square feet less. The other thing is, if we look at construction, you have a lot of construction prior to COVID was booming. I mean, prices were continuing to climb very quickly. Securing contractors was a challenge because they were so busy with work. And now you take a lot of non-essential construction workers, they've been sitting on their hands for the last 2-3 months. We certainly don't think construction costs are going to go down when this is all said and done, because they're going to be in even higher demand once building begins again. So we're still, again, sticking to the script, making sure that we get them open lean. You can always expand in the future. What a great problem to have 10 years in if you're blowing the doors off the place and are now in a position to build something or to purchase something and have the cash flow on hand to do so.
Yeah, fantastic. And Bob, you were speaking a little bit earlier about diagnostic equipment and rates on that and technology kind of adoption in the practice. But a lot of many practices, a big piece of many practices is the optical, of course. And I'm sure when you're opening cold, you're thinking about your optical, you're thinking about different frame lines in your dispensary, that kind of thing. I mean, are there any changes there in terms of your approach? Are you thinking about different frame lines maybe, or maybe fewer frame lines, or kind of any changes there?
When it comes to frame lines, I mean, retail component is still, when you take a look at MBA metrics out there, you're still looking at somewhere between, 51 and 65% in average practice in terms of a retail component to an optometrist office. We still need a strong retail component. The only thing that has changed during COVID is vendors have been willing to overlook past due balances and things for current practices or established practitioners. When it comes to cold starts, a lot of this money is paid up front. It's part of your budget. We also extrapolate the terms for a very long period of time. But just because of an epidemic that's only going to last us here, hopefully for less than a year, we don't want to change the tried and true methods long term of, changing the overall components of an individual optical. We still have to rely on demographic data that hasn't changed. We know how much household income is in a certain area. We know what the education level is. We know what the optical spend is in the surrounding blocks of that community. So our overall makeup of these frame lines is not going to change drastically from one community to another. The only thing that is going to change is going to be the way that we disinfect and clean these frames, which is going to increase costs. And so there's been a lot of talk over the last month of what products are appropriate to use on putting these on patients and being able to have them put them down into a separate sanitized tray and then putting them back up on the shelf after being sanitized. So we're promoting the use of, right now, EPA suggested chemical solutions. Pure and Clean is one of those that we've been using for a long time just on our eyelashes, that has also been shown to kill coronavirus, and we disinfect those things in front of patients and put them back. So we do have to change a little bit of the protocol, but the overall composition of the inventory in the dispensary still is very similar.
Yeah, those are great points, Bob. And one question that kind of pops up a lot of times, or oftentimes, not just, even pre-COVID, right? Just in general is, what is the right timing? Not necessarily timing in terms of opening your practice, but where you are in your career, right? So, a lot of new grads say, man, I'm kind of new grad. Should I wait? How long should I wait? Okay, maybe I should wait a year until I can save some money or get some experience. I mean, do you think there's a shift and that sort of when is the right time in your career to consider opening cold? Is it a bad idea for newer grads to consider it? Should they wait a year, or should they wait 2 years now, or 3 years? Any thoughts?
I think the big thing in terms of timeline is just as much a personal, life impact decision as it is a career decision. And so you have to decide, hopefully you understand the magnitude of the process of starting your own business and becoming a business owner. We still see the spectrum. So we have clients in their 50s that are cold starting for the very first time after a long career in corporate. We're actually seeing a fairly significant shift of individuals that have been practicing for 10, 15 years plus, where their scenario, they were effectively pushed out by a private equity takeover, and they no longer are either want to be a part of the practice, they don't want to sign a super restrictive non-compete agreement. And so they've built up a patient base in these areas and are now presented with the perfect opportunity to go out on their own and have these patients follow them. On the younger end, in terms of new grads, for those, we have some individuals that are self-financing or have private or angel investors, and they're in positions where we're even seeing some individuals already starting the process before they finish school. We are big proponents in all cases of associating. We don't believe that it's a good strategy to cold start your practice and go sit there 5 days a week and wait for patients to come. One, it's not a good business strategy. Two, you'll drive yourself absolutely insane. For those of us who aren't enjoying our quarantine time alone, you basically will be quarantining in your office, for a week at a time. And so, 3 days of doctor-patient care in the cold start, another 2-3 days if you're a 6-day-a-week person in associating, and that way you still have a predictive, steady income to help offset, your personal living expenses. And so we haven't seen a huge shift. We do see it shifting younger in the sense that, these new grads, they're tenacious, they're motivated, they're savvy, and they're in positions where they're on platforms like Covalent Careers, and they're seeing what's available and they're learning what they're capable of. And they, I think, realize that their toolkit is far more stacked coming out than perhaps they initially realized. And they're in positions to be able to succeed in these settings as well. And so it's very cool to see and to get phone calls from third years and fourth years that are already starting to think about it, as opposed to those that come out, get their first job, and maybe are in corporate or a different setting and say, well, I don't like this, so now I'm going to think about, what my other options are. We love seeing students exploring their options before they graduate.
Yeah, no, I think that's super important. And, I think it's a great point. I think that, there's a lot to take away from the talk here in terms of, opening cold, and, it's still very viable. It's still a great option, and, kind of nothing to fear, so to speak, right? But what would in the last couple minutes here, I mean, we've got a couple minutes here. So if you do have any last minute questions, please, send them over now. If not, when we close down here, you can definitely continue the conversation in the iCareAdvisors booth through chat, or I think your obviously your contact information is in your booth as well, so you can kind of follow up with these guys privately. But in just the last couple minutes here, the last minute or two that we have, I mean, what would your advice or message be to maybe those cold starts that kind of, they've already started cold, maybe they're just a year out. I mean, and times are tough for everybody right now, but maybe they're feeling it more because they are a cold start, or maybe not. I mean, what would your final kind of advice to those practices be, those kind of newer cold starts?
So we got quite a few of those. And this is a scary time, and it's a scary time for, established practitioners as well. And we certainly couldn't have predicted this type of pandemic. It's affected, many of us, our families personally, and it's been tough. And, the good thing is that there are resources available. So what we've done with our clients that are cold starts that are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years out is make sure that they had their hands on information for these resources, such as the PPP program, the second round, which should be funded sometime this week. There's also a component of the EIDL loan. Wanted to make sure that our clients would understand that they were eligible for these individual things. There are some local grants available to help them out, but we're all in the same boat together. And the one thing I think that's important to realize is that when you have an extensive stack of bills over the last couple of months and you haven't been seeing the normal patient volume, is our vendors still relied on us to distribute their product, whether it be contact lenses or whether it be frames. And they understand that they're all under significant amount of pressure as well. And they want us to continue to distribute their product, and they understand cash flow is tight. And this is when you're going to see who your true friends and allies are in the industry. And those have been stepping up for the last several weeks to give people breaks on certain types of subscription fees or rents or leases or loans. And I think that shows who our true friends are. Our particular vendor has been excellent with helping delay payments. And so we all are in it together, and we're all going to get through this together. And we're going to come out on the other side learning more. We're going to be more technologically advanced and even more ready to kind of supercharge our practice after the pandemic is over.
Yeah, I think that's a great final message there. And, in the end, we're all colleagues. We're on it together, and helping each other out is what we need to do. So, we appreciate you guys helping us out and sharing your information, your wisdom with everyone out there that's, thinking about cold starts, whether they're kind of just open cold, like you had said, or maybe they're thinking about it. But certainly to all those that are watching here with us, if you guys have any questions at all about opening cold, I mean, these are your guys, contact Eric, contact Bob, iCareAdvisors, chat with them. They're a wealth of knowledge and information. You could check out all of the, the things that we've done together over the years. I mean, how many videos have we done together? How many talks? We've done them live at Vision Expo. So this is a little bit different than maybe what we've done in the past, but it's still always fun to chat with you guys. And, so thank you. And a lot of people here in the chat are thanking you as well. So, we'll catch up with everybody in the next talk. It's going to be happening over at the My Eye Doctor booth. So head over there. We've got a couple of last Easter eggs that I'll be sharing with you guys. But otherwise, thanks again, guys. Really appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day, and hope to see you at, maybe Expo West if we're lucky, right?
We have our fingers crossed that we'll be seeing you in person and in Vegas at the end of September here. So
yeah, we'll plan on it. Let's make a plan for it.
All right, Antonio.
Take care, guys.
Have a good one.
Mhm.